Chapter 28. The wind was howling all around them when Dan and Malou realised where they had been transported in the last few minutes of being sitting on the sofa at the Hotel de Crillon. The trail ahead of them seemed to climb steadily into a bank of clouds resting above the top of a mountain ridge. Dan stopped and looked behind him. "My God, Damianos, where are we now?" The steep descent at his feet led straight down to a valley located miles below their footing. "Are we on Mount Everest by any chance?" When he noticed that Malou was attached to him by a length of rope and that she was dressed as an alpinist, he shouted to the barren hills extending to the right and left of them. "Where are you, you darned cat?" "Right here, my master," Damianos replied, jocularly, appearing out of the fog on the saddle of an old mule, laden with provision and sack of all kinds latched astride its back. He looked as if he had just emerged from the Nepalese mountains with some sort of bonnet and earmuffs protecting his head and neck. His hand-woven and apparently warm cassock and boots added a note of sobriety to the otherwise hilarious sight of him. Unable to contain the laughter a moment later, Malou finally said, "You look absolutely picture-perfect. Adorable is the word for you." "Well, thank you, Malou," replied Damianos, a broad grin appearing on his lips. "He looks like a Cheshire cat who has just swallowed his proverbial canary," Malou mused. "And as to answer your question, Dan, we are in the foothills of the Andes, ready to hike the flank of the mountain ahead of you." "And why are you doing this?" Dan demanded. "And where is the book?" "Aha, all very good questions, but to which I have only one answer. We need to climb a mile up, where we will find a cabin to rest for the night." "And Salangi and Damien are up there?" "That's what I've been told, yes," Damianos replied, kicking his mule to veer ahead of Dan to lead their climb. The hike was definitely exhausting, yet the steady pace they soon adopted helped their progress for the next hour as they went up the incline. The diminished oxygen prevented them to increase their speed, and when the cabin was in sight, it seemed that every step they took was more difficult than the last. When they finally reached the ledge on which the log house was located, Dan and Malou slumped to the ground and tried breathing gulps of air, which didn't seem to help restore their strength enough. "You've made it!" Salangi's voice came to their ears when Dan was ready to fall asleep already in front of the door. "And don't you dare take a nap now. You wouldn't wake up for hours if you did, my poor Malou," she added, shaking her by the shoulder. She was about to nod off as well. "Damianos," Damien shouted from the front stoop, "why don't you bring in the food? I have the stew pot ready." "I'll do that, no problem," their cat replied, dismounting the mule with agility and unstrapping a couple of sacks from the mule's load. When they entered the cabin, feeling better the moment they did, Dan and Malou were surprised to find the interior decorated as that of a Swiss chalet, complete with a cuckoo clock hanging on the wall adjacent to the immense fireplace. "I don't think you could find cuckoo clocks in these parts," Dan remarked, grinning. "Did you import the whole decor from Switzerland, or is that our new destination?" "I shouldn't think so, Dan," Damien replied as he bent down to pour some beans and lard into the steaming sauce bubbling happily in a large pot hanging over the fire. "What are you cooking?" Malou asked. "It smells absolutely delicious." "And that it is. It's what you call chili con carne, and it should be ready in about half an hour. Just time to relax." He straightened up and added, "In the meantime, why don't you take off your jackets and step over to the couch? Just relax. Salangi and I will be with you in a minute." After a meal that could have fed the hardiest of mountaineers, Damien went to the small bookshelf beside the fireplace, pulled the book out of it, and sat down again at the head of the table. "Here you go, Dan," he said, handing the volume to him. "After this you will have only 4 more tasks to accomplish. You have come a long way, and I would suggest this task will help you in persevering toward your goal." Dan returned Damien's smile and opened the book. "If all the tasks you have accomplished thus far were enough to attain your desired goal, you wouldn't be reading these lines. However, and since you are, in all that you will do, you will need perseverance. Perseverance is synonymous to persistence and force of character, which you will need in your future if you are to achieve redress of your present situation. And remember, perseverance is not in any way synonymous with stubbornness or arrogance. Leave those two to tumble down the mountain, along with self-importance or egotism." There was a moment of silence between all those sitting around the table after Dan closed the book. "Is this why we were climbing this mountain?" he asked, fixing his gaze on Damien. "Blindness and frostbites didn't prevent Sir Hilary to reach the top of the world, and neither should your impairment prevent you, Dan, to reach the summit of your endeavours. There are 2 things that stop most men from reaching the top of their mountains: egotism and self-importance, as the book said. You need all of the other qualities and aptitudes you have revisited up to now to complete this next task. You will need help through your recovery. You will need loving care. You will need to accept a helping hand, or you will not be able to reach the top of your mountain. In the day to come you will climb a few more miles, and always attached to Malou by the length of rope latched around your waist. The purpose for this will be for you to be aware of her at all times, and being able to help her should she fall during your trek." "Does that mean we'll have to be rock climbing as well?" Malou asked, already picturing herself planting pitons into the rock face of some cliff or other. "No, my dear, nothing that strenuous, no," Salangi said, smiling gently at her. "It simply means that you're in this for better or for worse, such as your marriage vows conferred upon each other and both of you." "I would never let my wife fall down a cliff," Dan declared adamantly. "Even if it meant saving one life rather than lose both." Damien looked at Dan with all the seriousness his question implied. "Think of your children, Dan," Salangi suggested. "If a choice would have to be made one day, which would it be?" "That's insane," Dan erupted, pushing his chair back and getting to his feet. "We're not here to sacrifice either of our lives," he went on distractedly, going to stand in front of the fireplace. "We are here to better our future, not to crash it with another miserable accident, are we?" Damien had never been a man to back down in front of a rebellious soul, and this time was no different than any other he had countered throughout his life. "No, you are not, Dan. Yet you are here to test all of your strengths and discard all weaknesses that might impair your progress and, in your case, your recovery. If the time should come when a life sacrifice is to be made in your future, you will need to prepare your mind for the eventuality, and the answer to your questions will only be dictated by circumstances, not by whatever you might or might not foresee at present." "So if that's the answer, why asking?" "Simply because your need for survival and for reaching your goal might be fraught with undesirable situations. Whatever may or may not happen, Dan, you need to persist and willfully continue on the road to recovery." Malou had been listening to this intense exchange with brimming tears in her eyes. She knew that Dan would sacrifice his life in an instant for her. She knew from the depth of her inner being, and at that moment she wished it was her who had crushed her head against that tree, that it was her who had been lying in the hospital, fighting for her life. But it was not to be. The past could not be undone, and only the future could be forged, whereby their lives would be preserved under a cloak of happiness. "Dan," she said, "come and sit down, will you? I think we still have to eat dessert." She threw him a glance that seemed to curb Dan's anger in an instant. Shaking his head and smiling at her, Dan regained his seat quietly. "You're right," Salangi said, not missing a beat. "Apple pie and ice cream are in order, I think." Dan turned to Damienos and looked at him, a smirk on his face. "You haven't said a word for the longest time. What's up?" "To tell you the truth, Dan, I could purr my contentment at this point. I've seen you grow into an admirable man in these past few days, and I couldn't be more satisfied with your progress." "Wow, certainly didn't expect to hear that from you. Sarcasm is usually your better choice of retort. What changed your tune?" "A prospect of guiding you both to the highest point of Pico Bolivar, attainable on foot, is simply delicious." Laughter had returned to the centrepiece of their conversation at last, and after eating dessert while enjoying the calmness of the surroundings, Salangi invited Dan and Malou to have a rest in the well-appointed bedroom of the chalet. Waking up with a start, perhaps expecting to find themselves somewhere else entirely, Dan and Malou smiled at each other when they noticed the sun streaming through the sheer curtains of the window in their room. Not forgetting they were in for one of the hardest tasks on their agenda, they dressed quickly and opened the door to the living room to find the furniture, including the bookcase, sideboard, couch, table and chairs, and the cuckoo clock had gone. Startled, they looked down at their 2 knapsacks, standing in the middle of the floor with a note pinned to one of them. "What does it say?" Malou queried, looking over Dan's shoulder. He had taken the note and was reading it. "It's from Salangi. Look." He handed her the small piece of paper. "It just says that they'll meet us in the valley upon our return. Is that it?" "I guess it is, hun. I suppose we'll find Damienos and his mule outside," Dan replied, going to the door and opening it. And yes, their cat was there, a rope in one hand and the reins of his mount in the other. "Good morning," he said cheerily. "You just have to get your knapsacks and we shall be on our way." "Are you going to rope us in with that cord?" Dan asked. "Absolutely, as soon as you're ready to tackle another day's climb." A few minutes later, Dan was leading them towards some designated spot on the flank of Mount Pico Bolivar. Soon deprived of necessary oxygen, their progress became more and more difficult. Stopping to rest, Dan said, "How far do we have to climb before we get to our destination?" If we keep a steady pace and if we don't stop too often, we should be arriving under the cable car that should bring us down to the valley in time for dinner." "And if we don't keep a steady pace?" "Well, Dan, in that case we'll spend the night somewhere on the slope of the mountain, I suppose." "All right, Damianos, let's get going then," Malou said, walking up to Dan and grabbing his hand. "Nowhere does it say in the book that I should walk 10 paces behind my husband, does it?" "No, it definitely doesn't, and I'll be glad for the company," Dan concluded, looking up at Damianos with a broad smile on his lips.